Chapters 14 through 17, market structure, are being condensed into one PowerPoint presentation. We're going to talk about the four types of market structure, and when we talk about market structure, we're talking about the degree of competition, number of suppliers, the control over price or not, no control over price, so things of that nature. And this slide shows the four market structures and some of the characteristics of each one. So let's look at perfect competition. We're going to begin with that one. Number of firms almost infinite. There's many firms in a purely competitive environment. There are no barriers to entry, which means no government regulation or no other issues that could prevent anyone from getting involved. Pricing decisions, marginal cost equals marginal revenue equals price. Output decisions, no output restriction. Interdependence, each firm is independent. There is no long-run profit. Price equals marginal cost. So as we go through this, hopefully that'll make a little more sense. The opposite extreme is monopoly, where there's only one firm, and you can see the difference throughout. And the two in between, the two market structures where most of our output and consumption lies, are monopolistic competition, and the other is oligopoly. Now, as a heads up, I'll give you some examples of each of these. Perfect competition would be industries like agriculture, farming, where there's no particular entrance requirement other than some money, of course. Monopoly would be something like a utility company. Now, monopolies per se are illegal in this country. However, the government allows utility companies to operate as what's called a natural monopoly, because to have competition would be inefficient. Monopolistic competition, example of industries would be things like cosmetics and service stations, fast food, etc. Items we consume on a regular basis. Oligopoly would be the industry of big ticket items, automobiles, for example, oil companies. So each of these has its own unique characteristics, and that's what we're going to talk about here. Characteristics of perfect competition: many buyers and many sellers. The goods offered for sale are largely the same. They're homogeneous, meaning that, for example, milk is milk. There's really no difference when the dairy farmer ships it to market, and firms can freely enter or exit the market. So because of 1 and 2, each buyer and seller is a price taker. By that we mean that they have no control over price. They have to take the price that the market is giving them. The revenue of a competitive firm: total revenue equals price times quantity. Average revenue equals total revenue divided by quantity equals price. Marginal revenue is the change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity. Marginal revenue equals price for a competitive firm, which means the competitive firm can keep increasing output without affecting the market price. So each 1 unit increase in quantity causes revenue to rise by P, by the price. Therefore, marginal revenue equals price. And that is the only true for firms in competitive markets, as we'll talk about shortly. So for the competitive firm, because price remains the same, we can see that marginal revenue is equal to price. For example, 2 units of output, 2 gallons of whatever here, times the price of $6 equals $12, which is $6 more than 1 gallon. At 3 gallons, still the price of $6, and because of that situation where the price remains the same, marginal revenue also remains the same and is equal to price. Profit maximization: the point where profits are maximized for the competitive firm is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And that's a key point, and it's pretty much true for all of these structures, market structures. Maximize profit, or I might interject here, minimize losses. The firm should produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And that's where the total revenue minus total cost is greatest. If marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, one should increase production. If marginal revenue is less than marginal cost, decrease production. So at any output with marginal revenue greater than marginal cost, we can increase quantity and that raises profit. At any quantity with marginal revenue less than marginal cost, reducing quantity raises profit. Again, produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So the profit for the individual firm, let's call the firm a dairy farmer, for example. The profit on the left side, frame A, represents the difference between price and average total cost. If price is greater than average total cost, the dairy farmer will be making a profit. As we'll see, that won't be sustainable because of ease in entry and exit. For now, recognize price equals average revenue equals marginal revenue, horizontal, perfectly elastic demand curve, which means essentially if the dairy farmer tries to sell his milk at a higher price than the market will offer, he will sell nothing at all. All right, so on the right side, a firm with losses, we have a situation where average total cost is greater than price, and the rectangle there represents loss. So talking a bit more about the graphs involved, on the left side here we have the long-run equilibrium in a perfectly competitive industry. Let's say the industry for milk. All right, downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve. We have thousands, hundreds of thousands of suppliers perhaps, and many more consumers. So the equilibrium price, where demand equals supply, then transfers over to the individual firm. Because remember, the firm has no control over price. They have to accept whatever the market is giving them. And so we have the long-run equilibrium for the for the perfectly competitive firm, and we see that marginal cost intersects marginal revenue at the minimum of average total cost. Now again, this is significant because the firm is producing at the lowest level of average total cost, and that is where they'll be stuck, or at least where they will return to if market changes occur. Now you might wonder, why wouldn't the dairy farmer, why would they stay in business if they're only covering their cost? Where's the profit? Well, remember our definition of economic profit, not only the accounting profit, but also the intrinsic, or the costs that are intangibles, the implicit costs. And so this represents for the dairy farmer an acceptable situation. We distinguish between shutdown and exit. A shutdown is a short-run decision not to produce anything because of market conditions. So the firm decides to shut down, to not go out of business per se, but to remain idle for a period of time. And normally, again, if the market is expected to recover, then the firm might indeed start producing again. On the other hand, an exit means that they're leaving the market entirely. So the difference here is if the shutdown in a short run, they must still pay the fixed costs. So a firm decides to shut down, to stop production for a period of time, they still have to pay their fixed cost. If they exit in the long run, they'll have zero cost. So the difference here between shutdown and exit represents kind of the shall we say, in the short run, the shutdown represents some optimism about the future, that the market will recover. Exit would represent basically a lack of optimism. A firm's short-run decision to shut down basically becomes a mathematical uh, study. They would shut down, again, temporarily discontinue if price is less than average variable cost. And above we show some of the reasoning there. If they shut down, their revenue loss equals total revenue. They're not going to produce, they're going to lose all of their revenue. Their cost savings from shutting down will be the variable cost. They're not going to pay for the feed and whatever else goes into the variable cost, but they still have to pay their fixed cost out of pocket. So the point is, shut down if total revenue is less than variable cost, and dividing both sides by Q, we get total revenue divided by quantity, less than variable cost divided by quantity. Okay, it's often said that perfect competition is the ideal market structure as far as the economist is concerned. So let's take a look at that. Let's assume that positive economic profits are being made in the short run for whatever reason. Perhaps an increase in demand for milk transfers to an increase in price the dairy farmer gets for their milk, that sort of thing. In the long run, firms enter the market. So again, with perfect information and so forth, we can have an influx of new dairy farmers entering the market, trying to get a piece of those profits. The short-run supply curve shifts to the right because now there's more dairy farmers. Supply increases, and price will decrease back to the minimum average total cost. Quantity increase, same price. There are more firms in the market, and it's an efficient scale. Okay, diagramming the increase in demand in the short run and long run. On the left side, we have the market, which is, again, the thousands of milk producers. Their market intersects at D1 and long run supply, which is horizontal. Now let's say that for whatever reason demand for milk increases. It's found to be healthy, whatever the case might be. Demand increases to D2, price in the market to P2. Now initially the firm had a price of P1, which corresponded to the market price, but when the increase in price occurred for the market, that benefit gets passed along to the individual firm, raising their prices to P2. And now we have a situation of short-run profits where, again, average total cost is less than price for the individual firm. Now, the dynamics of the marketplace here with perfect competition is that additional suppliers will enter the industry, causing an increase in supply of milk, and eventually price will return to the equilibrium level, which is P1 in this case. So, supply increases, ease of entry and exit, price goes down as a result of the influx of new dairy farmers, and we get back to the equilibrium or the efficient price level, efficient output level, P1. And this is a concept, or this is why economists feel that perfect competition is the ideal market structure, because the firms must produce at a minimum of average total cost. If they don't, they won't survive. Now conversely, if there were losses going on, then suppliers would leave the industry and price would also again revert to the equilibrium or the most profitable, most efficient price point. Okay, in the long run, we talk about economies of scale, constant returns to scale, and diseconomies of scale. You can see that the long run average total cost curve has compared to the hull of a ship, it decreases initially, economies of scale, total average total cost is decreasing as output increases. It reaches the minimum point, constant returns to scale, and this is generally a range of output, isn't just one ideal output. But if the firm grows too large, or the plant, for example, a factory gets too many people involved, it's more difficult to manage, etc., and we could result in diseconomies of scale. The average total cost curve increasing. So probably the optimal point for the firm is to produce under the range of constant returns to scale, because that's where average total cost is lowest. Again, this is a long run look. We've been looking at short run up to now. You can see that this long run average total cost curve is an envelope, it's called, of miscellaneous short run cost curves. The opposite of perfect competition is monopoly. A monopoly is a firm that is the sole seller of a product without close substitutes. And we're going to study monopoly and contrast it with perfect competition. And the key difference, a monopoly firm has market power. In other words, they are not a price taker. They can set the price, and they can influence the market price or set it directly, whereas a competitive firm has no market power. So why do monopolies arise? Well, the main cause is barriers to entry. Other firms cannot enter the market. And sources of barriers to entry: a single firm owns a key resource, such as De Beers owning most of the world's diamond mines, and the government giving a single firm the exclusive right to produce a good. And we have patent laws, copyright laws, and so on. And we also have, as I mentioned earlier, public utilities. Public utilities are granted a pass, if you will, from the government, because if we had competition in the, let's say, electrical generation, and every community had different power lines coming in with competition, that would be totally inefficient. So monopolies are allowed to exist in the case of utilities. Generally speaking, monopolies are illegal. We'll talk later about how the government prosecutes monopolies and so on. So differentiating what we call the two market extremes of monopoly versus competition. The monopoly is a price maker. They control the price. They're the sole producer. There's no competition. So therefore they face a downward sloping demand curve, and their demand curve is the same as a market demand curve because they're the only producer. The competitive firm is a price taker. There's one producer of many, and their demand is a horizontal line, which is the same as price. So perfectly elastic demand curve. So here we show profit maximization for a monopoly. And the key point here, one of the key points, is that the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost will be the output the monopolist will produce. So you see where marginal revenue intersects marginal cost at point A gives us the output level, and we go up to the demand curve to B to find out the monopoly price, what the monopolist can charge at that price. And the demand curve shows the price consistent with this quantity. Downward sloping demand curve. Again, the monopolist is a sole producer. Now, explaining the shape, we've talked about demand, we talked about average total cost, marginal revenue, the amount of additional revenue from one more unit of output. We can see that lies below the demand curve. The reasoning behind that is that if the firm wants to produce more output, they're going to have to accept a lower price. So in general, the generic reason is that the marginal revenue lies below demand, is that for any increase in output, the monopolist has to accept a lower price. So here we show the inefficiency of a monopoly. Downward sloping demand curve, marginal revenue lying below demand, marginal cost upward sloping. The firm will produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost and charge what's called the monopoly price and the monopoly quantity. And basically the area, the triangle, deadweight loss. And you can see if we go down to the base or the horizontal axis, the efficient quantity versus the actual quantity. So deadweight loss means, again, a loss of economic activity because of some interference in the marketplace. With taxes, we had the same identical issue of deadweight loss. Now, I'm going to revisit the concept of the firm producing where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The concept here is that if the firm can increase their output and at the same time increase their marginal revenue greater than marginal cost, the firm should produce more. If by increasing output they're adding more to marginal cost than to marginal revenue, they should reduce their output. There is no output level other than the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost, which will help the firm to either maximize profits or minimize losses. So in perfect competition, the firm will produce where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal, also equal to the price. Price equals marginal cost. For the monopolist, price is greater than marginal revenue equals marginal cost. If you look at the previous slides, you can see the price is greater than the point or the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost, and that's significant. When the price exceeds marginal cost, it means that there's some profit being made. And again, nobody denies a firm profits. It's the excessive profits that could accrue to a monopolist if they had sole control of the market and were of a mind to gouge the public, so to speak. And we can quantify a monopolist profit, total revenue minus total cost, and that equals price minus average total cost times quantity. So you can look at a graph of the curves, various cost and revenue curves for the monopolist, and quantify how much profit they're actually making. Public policy toward monopolies, and we're going to touch on this again later when we talk about oligopoly. But essentially, as far as monopoly goes, monopolies are not allowed in this country. They are if the monopoly forms, a antitrust division of the Department of Justice will do what they have to do to break them up. They will also try to prevent monopolies from forming by reviewing mergers and acquisitions to make sure we won't have unfair restraint of trade, it's called. And a brief history of antitrust laws. The Sherman Act of 1890 came about as the robber barons of that period, John D. Rockefeller, Carnegie, and such, were becoming very, very large relative to any competition, and were sometimes taking advantage of the situation. So the Sherman Act was meant to reduce the market power of trust. The Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 put some teeth into the antitrust law, the Sherman Act, by strengthening government's power and authorizing private lawsuits. The objective to prevent mergers that would be, again, unfair to the public, to break up companies that had become too powerful, and to prevent companies from coordinating their activities to make markets less competitive. In other words, to prevent companies from colluding on price. All right, here's a comparison between monopoly and competition. Similarities: the goals of the firm are the same, to maximize profits, and rule for doing that is to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Can they earn economic profits in the short run? Yes, for each. Remember, even in competition, short-run profits are possible, but they will be eroded in the long run as new firms enter the industry. Differences: many firms in competition, just one in monopoly. Marginal revenue equals price in competition. Marginal revenue is less than price in monopoly. Price equals marginal cost in competition, which means essentially the consumer gets the goods at cost, theoretically. In monopoly, price is greater than marginal cost, which means profits are being earned by the firm. Does it produce a welfare maximizing level of output? Yes, in the case of the competitive firm. No, in the case of monopoly. Remember, welfare maximizing, where demand and supply intersect in a free market enterprise, we maximize a total surplus. both to producers and to consumers. Entry in the long run, yes for competitive, no for monopolies. Monopolies have a monopoly. Again, there's a sole provider, and there's some vehicle, some process of preventing other firms from entering, such as a patent, perhaps, in a particular product, but more likely a government restriction or some sort of informal, should we say, agreement between certain individuals who will prevent one from, you don't compete in my market, I won't compete in yours, that sort of thing. Can they earn economic profits in the long run? No. For competition, we saw additional suppliers enter and erode the profits, and they get back to the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost at average total cost minimum. For the monopolist, yes, they can earn long-run profits. They are the only firm, and they can, again, will produce above the price, and they have the ability to maintain those profits. Price discrimination possible? No in competition, yes in monopoly. Charging different customers different prices for the same product, and the monopolist can do that. Okay, the previous slide apparently there did not like to be talked over, so I will go forward with the next slide. Competition with differentiated products. And summarizing up to this point, monopolistic competition is a hybrid between the competitive arena and monopoly. Has aspects of both. Again, this is the industry structure of for many cosmetic items and other consumer goods and services like service stations, fast food restaurants, etc. And in the long run equilibrium, if firms are making profit in the short run, then new firms can enter. There is ease of entry and exit, not as easy as pure competition, but it can be done. You can get a McDonald's franchise for if you have several $1,000,000, right? So there is some difficulty, but it doesn't take a special skill or any sort of government approval. Increases the number of products as new firms enter, and it reduces demand faced by each firm, so the demand curve shifts left, and each firm's profit declines until the point of zero economic profit. So competition with differentiated products. And here's where we're talking about differentiated products. Let's say that Bayer aspirin, Tylenol, other options, other products that are meant to relieve some pain, that is differentiated products. Advertising, if there's advertising being done, it's a pretty good sign that the firm operates in a monopolistically competitive environment. So in any event, profit maximization, again, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The price on the demand curve, if price is greater than average total cost, we have profits. Price less than average total cost, loss. And recall this is similar to the monopolistic firm. In this case, however, of monopolistic competition, we have ease of entry, and similar to perfect competition, any profits will be eroded as new competition enters, supplies and demand dynamics change. If there's losses being incurred, then firms are free to exit the industry, and we wind up at a long-run equilibrium, which is going to be shown shortly. So monopolistic competitors in the short run, this might look familiar to the monopolist position. We have downward sloping demand curve. There is some control over the marketplace, although the demand curve ought to be more elastic, because if McDonald's raises their price on let's say a quarter pounder significantly, customers can go over to Burger King and purchase a Whopper. There's elastic demand, greater than 1. Marginal revenue lies below demand. Again, to increase output, a lower price needs to be accepted. Marginal cost upward sloping, and you can see that where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, the price is determined by going up to the demand curve. So the price and profit maximizing quantity represent profit. The rectangle there between the demand curve and average total cost represents profit. And we could quantify that if we had numbers assigned to these illustrations. On the right, the firm makes a loss. Again, the average total cost lies above the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost, so the shaded rectangle represents loss. And here's how the monopolistic competitor looks in the long run after adjustments are made for either profit or loss. We see that demand is downward sloping, although more elastic than monopoly because there are substitutes. Marginal revenue lies below demand. Marginal cost and marginal revenue intersect. But notice when you go up to the demand curve, the price equals average total cost. The average total cost curve is tangent at the point of intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost, which means there's zero profit or loss to the firm. Again, bearing in mind that we're taking account of implicit cost as well as explicit cost. So the takeaway here is that the firm is producing at a relatively efficient manner, but not as efficiently as a peer competitor. With the peer competition, recall, average total cost was at its minimum where it intersected the price and demand curve. Here we have average total cost being less than its minimum. And here we look further at the monopolistically competitive firm, competition with differentiated products. Long-run equilibrium means zero economic profit. The demand curve is tangent to the average total cost curve at the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Price equals average total cost, but price exceeds marginal cost. So what that means basically, price exceeding marginal cost means that the firm is not as efficient as a perfectly competitive firm. The additional cost of product, of output, is less than the price that is charged to the consumer. So make note of that. The monopolistically competitive firm is efficient, but not as efficient as perfect competition. And one of the prime reasons for the difference is advertising, which some would call a deadweight loss. It's a cost to the producer, to whoever, let's say it's McDonald's versus Burger King. It's an additional cost to the producer without really adding any value to the final product. So advertising gets a bad rap in some quarters, but here we're going to look at the defense of advertising, providing information to customers so customers can make better choices, enhances the ability of markets to allocate resources efficiently, helps steer customers to a better solution perhaps, and it fosters competition. The customers take advantage of the price differences and allows new firms to enter more easily. So if you can get up a big advertising budget, you have a chance to make it as a newcomer. And criticisms of advertising, an attempt to manipulate people's tastes. It's psychological rather than informational. It creates a desire that otherwise might not exist. You've probably heard of this concept of Madison Avenue trying to dictate, and sometimes they do, what we purchase by what they're promoting. It impedes competition. Again, the larger company chances has a larger advertising budget. It increases perception of product differentiation and fosters brand loyalty. Again, if you want to consider that a criticism. And it makes buyers less concerned with price differences among similar goods. So that would refer to the case where people are going to buy a particular product simply because they have loyalty to that product for whatever reason, and those reasons probably arose from advertising. Okay, monopolistic competition between perfect competition and monopoly. I won't go through this whole thing, but you can see in the middle, monopolistic competition has some characteristics of pure competition and some of monopoly. And the last market structure is oligopoly. Oligopoly is a market structure in which only a few sellers offer similar or identical products. Sometimes the lines get blurred here, but back in the day, the big three, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, were considered an oligopoly. Now we also have to take account of Toyota and Volkswagen and so forth. But anyway, a few large firms controlling the market. There's strategic behavior because firms are interdependent. One firm's decisions about price or quantity can affect other firms and cause them to react. And so those reactions are taken into account when making decisions. One thing we'll talk about here briefly is game theory, the study of how people behave in strategic situations. Game theory was developed by an individual named John Nash. You might recall if you've seen the movie, I believe it was A Beautiful Mind, I think it was, starring Russell Crowe, based on some factual stuff where this guy was a mathematician at Princeton, and he went a little bit bonkers, he needed some psychological help, but he developed this concept of game theory. So game theory is meant to help us understand oligopoly and other situations where players interact and behave strategically. We talk about the dominant strategy, the strategy that's best for a player in a game regardless of the strategies chosen by the other players. And if you look in the text, there's a description of prisoner's dilemma, and much of game theory evolves from that concept, prisoner's dilemma, where two criminals are put in separate rooms and basically told things that would encourage one to, shall we say, point aspersion at the other to claim the other did the crime and vice versa. It's kind of interesting. If you want to take a look at that, it's in the text, prisoner's dilemma. Again, the starting point for game theory. Okay, an example, here we have AT&T and Verizon, and apparently they had an agreement to limit production, I suppose customers or cell phones or whatever, to 30, but they're going to renege on the agreement and produce a quantity of 40. So these are really tough to interpret, but in the bottom right quadrant here, AT&T's profit is 800. Verizon's profit is 800, and that's where they're going to wind up producing. Now you might ask, why not above that? AT&T profit is 1,000, Verizon's only 750. Well, this is part of the strategic game playing that goes on between competitors in an oligopolistic firm. You know, how you do this for us, we'll do that, and you know, it goes back and forth, and they realize eventually that competition is really probably not in their best interest, that they want to, you know, maintain profit at a high level for both firms. Otherwise, one firm will take action to erode the profit of the other. So again, it's complicated, difficult to interpret, but you want to find a point where both of them are best off, and from the sense of strategic game playing. Here's another example, in this case, running negative campaign ads. You can see that the dominant strategy in cases here is to run the attack ads, and that is going to cause each party, Democrats versus Republicans, to gain the most or lose the least. Public policy toward oligopolies. Again, governments can sometimes improve market outcomes. In oligopolies, with competitors having a motive to collaborate, to collude, collusion is illegal, collaboration implies something a little bit more benign. In any event, in oligopolies, production is too low and prices are too high. Production too low, prices too high relative to the social optimum. So the role for the policymakers to promote competition, prevent cooperation, to move the oligopoly outcome closer to the efficient outcome. And I'd add here, you know, if you want to look for a model, the demand and supply and all that for the oligopolist, We've really moved away from that, trying to diagram the oligopolist because essentially there are so many variables. How one competitor reacts to another, whether there's collusion or not, and so on and so forth. So we will not present any of that information here. It does exist in old textbooks, I recall, but it's no longer seems to be as much in vogue. So oligopolists are also subject to antitrust policy. Monopolist, because they are monopolistic and the government wants to prevent monopolies from forming. Oligopolies, because when you have a few large producers, you have the opportunity for price fixing agreements, which is illegal. You might have a situation where a merger, a proposed merger, would be too anti-competitive, and again, the antitrust people look at that. So some economists concerned that policymakers go too far when using antitrust laws to stifle business practices that are not necessarily harmful and may have legitimate objectives. You know, we in this country, the United States, have pretty strict antitrust laws. And the point here, extending on this second bullet point, is that many competitors or many other countries don't have the degree of, oversight that we have when it comes to antitrust action. So when we have a company like Ford or Chrysler trying to compete with, let's say, Toyota, Honda, Volkswagen, they are at a bit of a disadvantage because if they get too large, they're going to be slapped with perhaps some antitrust action, whereas other countries, other firms in other countries don't have those restrictions. So, and then the other issue that has been more recent is technology. You know, technological development oftentimes is going to lead to big business, Facebook, for example, Microsoft, and so on. And that is just a natural reaction in the marketplace to the changing nature of technological development. So again, the insight here from many economists is to be more liberal with our antitrust actions, to be more accepting of big business. All right. So we'll talk briefly about the major antitrust laws that evolved as time went on. I think we mentioned earlier the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which outlaws every contract, combination, or conspiracy in restraint of trade and any monopolization, et cetera, et cetera. So in 1890, we were in the midst of our Industrial Revolution and many trust forms. A trust implies that one company is controlled by different companies. Everything funnels into the main central company. And these trusts became very, very large and relative to competition. And again, in those days, they were not perhaps as ethical as we would have, and people would have liked them to be. So the point here, the Sherman Act was in response to consumers' shall we say, outcry for more fairness, more ethical action on the part of these trusts. And the politicians of the day responded by passing the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now the reality is that the act carried very little consequences. It had no teeth to it to speak of. It didn't define these terms, monopolization, contract, combination, etc. But it was a step in the direction of getting more control over the monopolies. The Clayton Act in 1914 again put some teeth into the law. It targeted specific practices such as mergers that would create a monopoly. It led to the Robinson-Patman Act, and the Clayton Act itself outlawed price discrimination, which was evolving later to the Robinson-Patman Act. It also outlawed tying contracts. A tying contract is where if you purchase, for example, and going back to a real-world example, back in the day, IBM had a virtual monopoly on mainframes, a very large unit, centralized. And if you bought their mainframe, you had to purchase their service contract. Very lucrative for IBM, the service contracts. Another tying issue that comes to mind back in the day, again, Microsoft, if you bought their operating system, you had to buy their browser. I believe that was Internet Explorer. So Microsoft came under the gun for that, and they have been involved in several antitrust actions. And then we go along to the Federal Trade Commission Act in 1914 to ban or enforce anti-competition laws and prevent unfair methods of competition. And finally, I'd like to discuss the Robinson-Patman Act, which was passed during the Great Depression, and really, again, talking about price discrimination. And it's one of the least understood of the American antitrust laws. Elements must involve some aspect of interstate commerce, in other words, Wisconsin shipping to Illinois, vice versa. Discrimination must arrive out of at least 2 consummated and contemporaneous sales transactions. And discrimination must be by the same seller in dealings with different purchasers. So this gets kind of tricky in the real world because let's say you're a manufacturer selling to wholesalers in Utah or wherever, and you have buyers for your product, and you sell the same buyer the same product at different prices. You could be prosecuted under Robinson-Patman technically. However, there are extenuating circumstances. If one distributor buys in bulk and quantity, and hence they get volume discounts, that can be an argument against, in defense of the particular company if they're confronted with antitrust action. So anyway, this is a particularly questionable and there's a lot of gray areas with Robinson-Patman price discrimination, and good to be aware of if you ever wind up in a position where you're conducting business interstate and you have any control or discretion over prices and so forth. And finally, the 4 types of market structure. A little flow chart here, the number of firms and types of products. So a review, hopefully, although I think of interest, is to look at the examples. For the monopolist, examples would be tap water and cable TV. Tap water, I assume, being a utility in most instances, and cable TV, well, not so much anymore. Perhaps there's a little bit more competition, but at one time it was monopolistic. Oligopoly, big business, you've got tennis balls and cigarettes. I mentioned cars and oil refineries. Well, some consumer items like tennis balls are made by a few, Rawlings, Spalding, whatever, and cigarettes, a few large manufacturers or suppliers there. Monopolistic competition, novels, movies, again, service stations, fast food restaurants, things we purchase on a routine basis. And perfect competition, the market structure, the ideal as far as economists are concerned, and we should be concerned because we get the product at the lowest average total cost. Wheat and milk are examples there. So that concludes a very long discussion. Your head might be swimming by now, and let me just assure you, the graphing and such is for illustration only. I'm not going to ask you to graph anything. And, the graphing or the models help to understand certainly the market structure, and it will come in very handy there. But other than that, I guess we are concluding the chapters 14, 15, 16, and 17.